Welcome to The Ally Effect with Allyson Blythe, authentically living life your way. We all contemplate making changes in our lives that would allow us to live more authentically, but it can be hard to take action. Allyson is here to educate, equip, and empower you with the tools you need to start authentically living life your way. Get ready to eradicate your limitations and destructive patterns as you take full responsibility for your own happiness. This show is not just talk. It is conversation for profound self-awareness, acceptance, and appreciation, the key elements to stepping into the power as the creator of your very best life. The Ally Effect with Allyson Blythe starts now.
Hey everyone, and welcome. You're listening to The Ally Effect, authentically living life your way with me, Allyson Blythe. You can join me the first and third Thursday of every single month right here on Transformation Talk Radio as we dive deep into this concept of authenticity and helping you along your way in order for you to live so much more authentically. So last time we ventured into this topic of communication, and here we are in part 2. One of the things that I think is so incredibly important to realize is just how easily communication can go awry. It's such a delicate thing. And it's the lifeline of everything that we do. And yet many of us will hold it pretty haphazardly, kind of randomly venture into any communication that we have with other people, no matter how long we've been in relationship or how much we care about them. A lot of times we plan our day or even our vacation much more intentionally than we plan our conversations with other people. Perhaps you say something and just assume that someone fully understands what you're trying to communicate. Maybe you're someone who makes hints, or you're very passive, thinking that people can somehow magically read your mind or know what it is that you're actually really trying to say. Maybe you think people, because you've been in relationship with them for a really long time, should just know what you're wanting and what you're needing. And yet the realization that that's just simply not realistic. How quickly things can go awry with the people that we most care about. My hope is that as I tune your ear and your heart to these top 10 patterns, you have a little bit more awareness of the ways that you're venturing into conversation and recognizing how you're enhancing that path of authenticity with your own personal awareness and being true in what you're wanting to say and communicate with other people. Also, that you're more plugged in and actually present with the here and now, tuning in to what's going on inside of you so that you can communicate more effectively, but also hold space for people as they're trying to communicate with you. Last time we talked about some patterns about communication. We explored some of the dynamics and the realization that communication over the years has evolved in so many different ways. If you remember, we ventured into this realization that communication actually started with cave paintings. And we've moved through the years to things like cell phones and Twitter and the advancements with all of these ways that we have to communicate. I think most people would assume that we're so much better at it. It's so much easier, and we have so many different methods to communicate. We've advanced so far from telegraphs and cave paintings and things like that. And yet what I know for sure is that people are in such a desperate need to actually communicate, to hear each other, and to connect in those ways. We talked a little bit about the nonverbals, the things that the words that you choose, the behaviors that you use, things that you do and you don't do, that all send a message, and how effective those are in delivering what it is that you actually want to say. We talked about some reasons why people actually communicate. We started at the top level, that oftentimes we just communicate to convey information. We're trying to give or receive information in a pretty basic, simple way that people communicate. And the realization that even that tendency can go really off the rails. But then we ventured through that list to explore a little bit more about people having conversation actually with this deep, heart-centered need of wanting to be understood, wanting to be heard, wanting to be known. And if you're using any of these top 10 patterns that we're going to be discussing, you can recognize how much that works against you, and definitely in terms of your walk of authenticity. So one of the patterns that I have, if you don't know this quite yet, one of the things that I do on a consistent basis, just to make sure we're in the same line of thinking, is that I will often grab my phone and ask Siri, hey Siri, define such and such. And so I did that with this thing of communication. And I started with this basic definition: the imparting or exchanging of information or news. Pretty simple, right? That if we're conveying information or we're trying to somehow submit it, another definition is a letter or a message containing information or news. And yet the truth is, we know the communication is so much more important than that. It means so much more. There's depth and substance. There's assumptions that kind of roll into this. There's connectedness and the need, again, to be heard, to be known. So with that, I started to kind of go a little bit deeper. That's a basic definition of communication, but it didn't quite hit the nail on the head for me. And so I started to look for some quotes so that I could wrap my mind around this thing called communication. And I found one from Quote Master, and it reads, effective communication requires more than an exchange of information. When done right, communication fosters understanding, strengthens relationships, improves teamwork, and builds trust. Yeah. Sit with that for a minute and realize that ultimately the reason that we're using words, that we're trying to engage in some type of communication, is so that we can improve relationships, foster some level of understanding that we have with other human beings, and certainly in terms of enhancing the trust level that we have with other people. Imagine if we, every day when we were thinking about selecting words and engaging in conversation, if we kept that realization in the back of our mind, the delicate nature of this thing called communication. In every way, in every day, we are communicating something. The words that we choose, the behavior that we use or don't use, everything you do and everything you say is communicating something. Have you ever taken the time? Remember, this is a show about authenticity. So this is about your side of the street, my own side of the street. Have you ever taken the time to really stop and think about how effective your attempts at communication are? Do you find yourself in the same old patterns over and over and over again, engaging in conversation with people or banging your head against the wall because you just feel like you cannot get through to someone? Communication is by far the thing that people come the most into my office. People will seek my services, whether it's the workshops that I teach, the sessions that I offer, the coaching. People will often venture into my office because of complications with communication. This is the thing that drives most people, whether it's couples work, whether it's parent, child, whether it's just someone themselves, kind of coming in, help me understand where communication is going so wrong. So we did that last time. We ventured into the top 5. We covered patterns that included criticize, attack, and scrutinize, demand and impose. The third one was hinting, passivity, and suggesting. The fourth one were what I refer to as the fighting words of always and never. And then the fifth one being judgments and labels. If you haven't taken the time yet to listen to that episode, I would really encourage you to go back and take your time, learn those top 5 so that you can cue your mind and your ears to those patterns, and you can start to listen for when any of those begin to creep into your communication. There's some valuable information in that last episode, and it'll just be more awareness of these patterns of the top 10 things of what not to do in communication. That's the ultimate goal, is that you have increased awareness of what you're doing and how you're working to increase your level of authenticity. But if you did tune in last time, I'm wondering, what were some of the 5 that you noticed as you had those 5 in the back of your mind? Were there some patterns that you were more in tune with? Did you recognize in your interaction or exchanges with other people, were there patterns that you were like, oh, wait a minute, this is what that show was talking about. These are one of the patterns. I began hinting at something that I wanted. I just used an always or a never. I know that's language, even as long as I've done this work, this language that begins to creep even back into my own communication with people. What patterns stuck out the most? And staying true to authenticity. Remember that this is about your side of the street. Maybe you saw some things inside other people. Maybe you recognize these in your family or in your workplace, but ultimately on your side of the street, what did you start to notice? So today we'll address the next five tendencies that tend to interfere with communication. Remember, we talked about that basic level versus the heart of the matter, really boiling it down to wanting to feel heard and connected with other people, ways to build trust. These next five patterns you'll recognize that interfere pretty much with the connectedness and erode your level of safety and trust with the other people that you most care about. They also disconnect you from you. When you're engaged in any of these top 10, it disconnects you from self-awareness. And because it's a show about authenticity and being so in tune to what's going on inside of you, if you're engaged in any of these top 10, chances are your focus is outside, not in here, which is what our ultimate goal is. So what are the next five? Personalize is number 6, jumping to conclusions, assigning motives, complaining and criticizing. And then the last one, number 10, sarcasm and humor. We're going to go through each of those 5 as we spend our time together. The next 3, 6, 7, and 8 have really under the umbrella of assuming. It's making assumptions about certain things. They are a little bit different. They have a little bit different flavor or personality. But if you kind of go under the guise of assuming, that's what these 3 fall in under the umbrella of assuming. And so I did it again. I looked up another definition. And again, at dictionary.com, the word assume means supposed to be true without proof. How often are you engaged in conversation, assuming that something is absolutely true without proof? All right. So we start to tell ourselves a story and we think we know for sure. And you don't even realize that you're doing it. Something has happened. Somebody says something and you begin to believe you know for sure. And when in reality, those things, the assumptions that we're making are rarely based on facts. They tend to be based on your history, the past experiences that you have with someone, your current mood, or the lens you have of the world. Assumptions are really, really dangerous. So another quote before we wrap up this segment. The problem with making assumptions is that we believe that they are the truth. We make an assumption, we misunderstand, and then we take it personally. Then we react by sending emotional poison with our word. This creates a whole big drama for nothing. And that was off of a site called QuoteGram. Yeah, emotional poison and the risk factor when we make assumptions, the danger that those do. So we'll talk about those next 3. You are listening to The Ally Effect, authentically living life your way with me, Allyson Blythe. And we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll talk about the next 5 patterns of what not to do in communication. We're back here on The Ally Effect with me, Allyson Blythe, certified life coach and licensed clinical social worker. You're listening to The Ally Effect. And we do have a very, very special guest today who's very intrigued by this topic of communication. She's going to make a quick appearance and then head on out as she learns what she needs to learn about communication. That, my friends, is Boo Kitty, and she is a very special entity on this show and makes her appearance when she decides to. So I want to make sure that you know how to be in touch with both me and Boo Kitty if you ever need more information about these topics that we're covering about authenticity. And you can always visit my website, which is my name, Allyson Blythe .com, AllysonBlythe.com. She's got me a little distracted, I must admit. AllysonBlythe.com. Or if you want to send me an email, I'd love to hear from you. AllysonBlythe@live.com. And then, as always, you can send me a message on that social media platform, which is Allyson Blythe Life Coach. Any social media platform, share with me. I'd love to hear your venture about authenticity. I think she's going to have some good stuff to share. She might even want to chime in on this thing called communication and helping us understand the authenticity of it. So today we're talking about the essential tools of communication and tuning your ear and your heart from this concept of authenticity and realizing things that you may be doing that are moving you further and further away from the heart of connectedness, helping you understand the next 5 patterns. So what are they? The first one is personalize, your tendency to take things to heart. Jumping to conclusions, assigning motives is number 8. And then 4 is complaining and criticizing. And then 5 is sarcasm and humor. We're going to talk about each of these 5. All right, so as we venture in this pattern called personalizing, I want to tell you about a client of mine by the name of Sarah. And Sarah is 28 years old. And as a child, Sarah spent an awful lot of time with her grandma, who she loved very, very much. And she spent a lot of time with her grandma. And during the course of her care, she remembered a certain occasion in which she was sitting on her grandma's lap. And during that time, she was making comments and they were playing, and just a really beautiful, loving exchange. And during the course of that, Sarah made some comments about her grandma's really big, pokey belly. And she would poke at how big her belly was. And then she would also comment about her old looking skin. And she would pick at her skin and talk about how old her skin looked. And in probably very loving, true grandma fashion, her grandma reprimanded her gently, but very firmly, commenting that she shouldn't say things like that. Sarah was just very innocently making an observation with childlike eyes, meant absolutely no harm about her grandma's big belly or her old looking hand and skin. Actually, she was just lovingly commenting. And her grandma probably trying to teach her about politeness and social etiquette and different things that kids usually need to learn. They're beautiful in the fact that they often don't have a filter. And so they went on with the day, but Sarah's little heart was hurt. She knew that she had misstepped with her grandma, but they went about their day. The tragedy struck just a couple weeks later when, sadly, Sarah's grandma died of a heart attack. And in her innocent little nature, Sarah drew this conclusion that her words, her commentary about the big belly and the old skin had actually killed her grandma. Oh my gosh, the faulty conclusions that we make in childhood, the way that we put things together. And Sarah, now coming into me as a 28-year-old, had certainly put that out of her mind. We were talking about it in terms of just childhood events and things that had impacted her. And Sarah was able to report to me that she had this lifelong tendency to take things personally, that she would believe that she was often the cause of things that fundamentally had absolutely nothing to do with her. She had a tendency to over-own responsibility, the way that people reacted to things or the way that they felt. It's one thing as a child when we have these patterns, we put these faulty conclusions together, but as an adult, do you have a tendency to personalize? Do you have a tendency to kind of put things together in your own mind and believe that they have anything to do with you? Sarah had a lifetime of feeling single-handedly responsible for other people, places, and things that, quite frankly, had absolutely nothing to do with her. But because of that innocent type experience as a child, she had put those things together and drawn that conclusion that things were somewhat up to her about how they turned out. Are you someone who takes things to heart? Something happens, someone says something or doesn't do something. Do you have a tendency to take that very personally? You walk into a room and people are giggling or snickering or they're talking, and then they stop talking when you walk in, and you just know for sure that they're talking about you, or they know about that bad date you had the other night. Like, do you personalize things as though other people's behavior. The clerk at the grocery store who maybe just found out yesterday or tomorrow was going to be her last day because they're downsizing at the store, or her mother has gotten a serious diagnosis and she's putting your eggs at the bottom of the bag and the cans on top. Do you walk away from that thinking like, geez, what did I ever do to her? Do you take other people's behavior personally? Traffic is one way that we do this. The driver cut me off. Someone says something or doesn't say something, they do something or they don't do something, and suddenly you believe it has anything to do with you. Do you have a tendency to think things are your fault or they're your responsibility? I refer to that as over-owning, that you're stepping outside of your own personal hula hoop and you're over-owning things for people. It causes a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of sense of insecurity, and certainly a distorted perception of how you're experiencing it. It's the work of Don Miguel Ruiz and his book, The Four Agreements. If you haven't had the time to ever check that book out, I would highly recommend it. He talks about don't take anything personally. Could you imagine what life would feel like if we just didn't take anything personally? I think there is a time and a season for reflection. If something happens, did I have a part in that? What was my role? What was my side of the street? But yeah, that thread of just releasing that anything has anything to do with us about other people's behavior. A lot of wisdom in that offering. Don't take anything personally. And I say this with much love and assurance. Most people are not thinking a thing about you. You know why? Because they're too busy thinking about themselves. So it's kind of, I mean that very reassuredly, like most people are just very busy thinking about themselves, not about what you did or what you didn't do. So that's number 6. Number 7 is jumping to conclusions. Now, what I know to be true is that the mind looks for things to understand. Something will happen and the brain wants to make sense of something. It wants to put pieces together. And I call it like digestion. It wants to be able to digest an occurrence so that it can make sense of it. You see something that happens or you have an experience and the brain begins to fill in the blanks with things that probably didn't even happen, but we believe to be true. You take pieces of different situations and you weave them together to create this story. The issue is that we do this based on our own experience, the lens through which we see the world, the history that we have in the world, our own belief systems about people and about occurrences, and also our own personal perspective. So understanding, now I'm going to do a lot of prefacing to this story because I think it's really important to understand. I have been doing this work for over 30 years. I have written a book. I teach a workshop, The Art of Effective Communication. I'm offering this and the top 10 things of what not to do. And I'm saying all of that because I'm going to share a very humbling story with you because this is a show about authenticity, and sometimes a lot of humility comes with authenticity. I have told this story many times, and I offer it to you to help you see how quickly the brain can just go off the rails. Remember, I said in the beginning that this is a tendency. It's so critical to have this delicate conversation with people, and yet how often the brain starts to go to these habitual patterns. So let me tell you the story. I love to walk, and I've lived in the same neighborhood, and there's this long stretch of sidewalk that takes you through beautiful trails and by water. And I walk it often, very often. And over the course of years, I have noticed a woman, and she's very lovely, and we often exchange pleasantries, and it's just a very civil, oh, good morning, how are you? Fine, fine. And for years, this has happened. But there was a season of time when I started to recognize that this woman seemed to be walking a lot, like really a lot. And to the point where I was starting to make note, like, what in the world? I would drive to where I was going to walk and I would see her ahead of time. And then I was walking and I would pass her and then I would see her as I was leaving. Sometimes I would go home and I would shower and I'd drive back through the neighborhood and she would still be walking. My friend, she just seemed to be walking, sometimes literally day and night. And so I started, with all this wisdom and clinical experience I have, I started to fill in the blanks, to jump to these conclusions. And in all my wisdom, remember, I said we tend to see the world through the lens through which we believe, the perspective that we hold. Well, part of my world is offering diagnosis, that I will see situations with people and I will conclude diagnosis. I have the credentials to do that, and I'm paid by insurance companies at times to do this. So yes, even though this woman has zero impact in my life, she's not someone who is any of my business. All of a sudden, I started to jump to conclusions about her. And I started to think, I believe she has an eating disorder. I think with all of this walking, she's trying to do all of this because with compulsive exercise to manage. Understand that I started to fill in all of these blanks with this woman. So imagine my surprise one morning as I was venturing out onto my walk, and I get out of the car and I start up the hill, and I suddenly see her coming down the hill. And I'm a little taken aback because as I look at her, I also look to my left and I see that there's two of her. So my friends, you see what happened is that she actually didn't have an eating disorder that I know of. She actually had a twin. In spite of all my wisdom, all my teaching, all my life experience, I began to formulate a conclusion with someone that had nothing to do with me, a lens through which I saw a situation when in reality, the woman was simply had a twin who was the other walker, which is why she seemed to be walking so much. It's humbling to realize how distorted the brain can be and how it can make stuff up. Is this a pattern? Do you have a tendency to jump to conclusions? This one is embarrassing enough, and yet it really, no one would ever know if I didn't keep telling the story. But I wonder for you, in your personal situation, do things happen and you begin to jump to conclusions about things that are happening? That is pattern number 7 that I will caution you on. So you are listening to the Ally Effect, Authentically Living Life Your Way with me, Allyson Blythe, certified life coach and licensed clinical social worker. We're going to take a break. And when we come back, we're going to keep talking about these patterns of what not to do in communication. We're back here on the Ally Effect, Authentically Living Life Your Way with me, Allyson Blythe, certified life coach and licensed clinical social worker. Now that our special guest has passed, I want to be able to offer one more time ways to be in touch with me. If you want to visit my website, please do so, AllysonBlythe.com, where there's lots of information and you can have access to information about me, my services that I provide, the book that I wrote, Misunderstood. And if you want to follow me on any social media platform, it's Allyson Blythe Life Coach. And I have, remember we talked about types of communication? I have an old-fashioned landline, 859-341-7773. I'd love to be in touch with you. So we're talking about this conversation, communication, and the ways that things go awry in there. I shared with you before we went to break this story about the walker in my neighborhood and the ways that I began to kind of jump to conclusions, the ways that I started to fill in the blanks of what I was actually seeing. Is that a story that you can relate to? As embarrassing as it might be for me to tell it, I share it with you to help tune you in to your own patterns. We began with understanding personalization and how often you may be taking things straight to heart and believing that they have anything to do with you directly. Do you personalize? Do you have a tendency to jump to conclusions? Again, I'd love to hear your stories. So miscommunication, and basically just understanding that though it's incredibly common, it's just the discrepancy between what is being said versus what is being heard. It seems so easy. I say something, you take it in, we connect, we maybe converse some more, bada bing, right? It seems like it should be so easy. And yet we realize that so many things can take it off the rails. People assume that they've delivered a message very effectively and that it's been received perfectly without ever really checking it out. In my work with clients, I will often say to them, and sometimes I can gauge by their reaction or their body language. Remember, we said everything that happens sends some kind of message. You're communicating. Body language is another way that we're doing that. But understanding that, I will often ask clients, what did you just hear me say? You would be amazed at the reflections I get back, the words that leave my mouth, and something that sometimes happens, the way that it's received and what's reported back. Have you ever taken the time to ask someone, what did you just hear me say? I think it's just important, not in an accusatory way, right? But in a very connecting way to make sure. How often do we check deadlines or the time the meeting actually starts? How often are we checking details? And yet with this delicate thing called communication, with this heart of the matter of wanting to really connect and be understood, are you taking the time to ever ask, what did you just hear me say? Or reflecting back to someone, hold on a minute, what I just heard you say was... that one simple tool and the changes that it can make. How often I've had to clarify actually what I was trying to say was, and then how much more effective it is once I know there's been like some type of distortion or misrepresentation of what I intended to convey to people. There's so many risks in assuming things to be true, in creating stories. Do you start to write a story in your head or fill in the blanks? If you have your own stories or those moments or circumstances that you know you've been affected by some of these patterns, this is your point of self-awareness to begin to recognize ways to do it differently. Can you see how using any of these patterns that we've shared about so far can really create some level of misunderstanding, even defensiveness with the people that you care about? And sadly, even patterns of resentment and hostility. We see that though it's this delicate thing, very quickly it can go wrong. Are there examples that you can think of where you know that you've been influenced by one of these patterns? Maybe you've been on the receiving end of some of these and you recognize how hurtful or confusing it can be. So let's move on to the next one, which is assigning a motive. This one was fascinating to me as I was sitting with clients. I teach life coaching groups. And in one of the groups in particular, this woman was having a really significant dilemma. I talk, this class specifically is about boundaries, and we hold really deep conversation and clarification about what boundaries are and how to communicate them, how to set them and establish them. Really, really cool work. But in this particular group, we were talking about communication boundaries, and specifically with technology these days and the ways that people think they're communicating. And the word that they were reacting to was the word sure. Have you ever sent a message that says sure? It was fascinating because there were 6 women in this group and they were truly divided. It was 3 and 3. 3 of the women, this pattern of assigning motives, understood sure to mean not really, but if I have to, or that's fine type energy. And I was like, really? I've probably sent hundreds of sure messages, meaning sure. And the other 3, and I was more aligned with this group, that sure meant, yeah, sure, absolutely. Like, no, but we start to assign motives of what people really meant by simple words like sure. Another one that was catching a lot of people's reaction was the thumbs up emoji. Like, seriously, you can't even attach a word or a phrase that somehow the thumbs up emoji was creating these boundary issues. It's fascinating to think about the different ways people have to communicate or ways that we react to things. Remember, we said in the last segment that the brain will often search to understand things. And one of the pieces to try to understand, the brain will often look for why. When something has happened in your life, how often the first question you may ask is, why? Why did that happen? Why did they do that? Why didn't they do that? And the brain begins to reel for some level of understanding. Okay, that's a pretty normal thing. But in asking the why, we're trying to assign an intent. We begin to try to understand the motive behind which someone did or didn't do something, why life occurred under these circumstances. The brain looks for the why of a situation. How often are you assuming and making things up, thinking you know for sure why someone did something? If someone steps on your toe and you jump to the conclusion that they did it on purpose, I know that they were trying to hurt me. They always do things like this to me. They just wanted me out of the race, right? Like the energy, the story, you have what's actually happened. Someone has stepped on your toe, and then you have the undercurrent of your story and the emotional fuel that you add to it. If you assign that type of motive, what would it be like to practice something different and start to assume the best? I know that they didn't, this really hurts. You can validate yourself. This really hurts, but it's not the end of the world. My toe is not going to fall off. I know that they didn't do it on purpose. It was totally probably an accident. Like, what if when something happened, you actually assigned the most positive of motives that could have happened? If someone doesn't respond to a text message, are you the first person to think they were trying to exclude me? They don't care about me. They're ignoring me on purpose. What is the story of why you're believing people are doing certain things? What if you were able to switch that to the story of, I know that people are busy. There have been dozens of times when I've looked at a text message and I just got busy, or I didn't know that they had texted back. I know people are doing their best. Do you see how it changes the interaction or the emotional exchange we have with someone? What are the assumptions or the ways that you assign motives to people, especially some of the people that you care most about? So let's talk about the next pattern, number 9, which is complaining and criticizing. Now, I have to preface this one too. I am a therapist, and my job is to hold space and hold conversation for people and with people who are complaining. Something has happened, something has not happened, and people have a lot of feelings, emotions, and thoughts about this thing. So it absolutely will have its time in place. If you are an external processor and it helps you to be able to vent and get things out, you can maybe do a little bit of a purge. And then after you're feeling better, you can start to put the pieces together and get yourself calmed down or get a little bit of perspective. Maybe you're looking for some validation, and that launching of complaint really is purposeful for you. Absolutely fine. This pattern has its time and its place. The risk factor, I will say, though, is that we can get stuck. Complaining and criticizing can be very contagious energy. Have you ever had an Eeyore in your life? Or have you ever had someone point out like, oh, have you seen this, this, and this, and this? And before you know it, like your focus starts to go on this, this, and this. Like you're starting to recognize the bad of the world, the hard, the way people did things. What is it? Are you affected by the complaining and criticizing? Are you Eeyore bringing kind of that heaviness or negativity to the party? You can get very stuck in complaining and criticizing. And it's also very contagious energy where we begin to find fault in the things that are happening. And very much like they say, sometimes there's gateway drugs. I believe this to be kind of like a gateway pattern to some of the other tendencies, that if you are focused and you're locked in on the complaints and the criticism before long, how you are launching into judgment and assumptions about things, it kind of lead to some of the other patterns. So complaining and criticizing and giving yourself maybe a time period that you allow yourself to do that before you start to switch a little bit, being able to understand that this can skew your perspective in a pretty heavy way. So complaining and criticizing, though a time and place, only so much. All right, drum roll, number 10. And I'm going to preface this one too. Sarcasm and humor. Now, let me say, I love sarcasm. I think it can be clever. I think it can be very, very witty. And what I also know for sure is that we have this tendency with sarcasm to be able to be passive aggressive about something. Maybe there's a longstanding situation and we want to poke at someone. And then we always get to step back under the guise of humor. And I don't know why you're reacting. What's wrong with you? I was just kidding, right? And so I also looked up the definition. I actually know this one. And in Latin, it is the cutting of flesh. Merriam-Webster provided a definition of a sharp and often satirical or ironic utterance designed to cut or give pain. Ouch. You would begin to rethink this element of sarcasm with an understanding of that definition. So also very much, it might have a time and place. Sarcasm and humor has a way of lightening up a mood at times when taken too far or using with passive aggressive tendencies. I think you make a good thing kind of go wrong. There you have it, my friends, the top 10 things of what not to do. When we come back, we'll review them one more time, just go through the list and talk about a few other things. But you're listening to The Ally Effect, authentically living life your way, with me, Allyson Blythe, certified life coach and licensed clinical social worker. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're back here on The Ally Effect, authentically living life your way, with me, Allyson Blythe, certified life coach and licensed clinical social worker. We're diving deep into this conversation about authenticity and helping you recognize the top 10 patterns of what not to do in communication. So I'm going to go through them one more time. I'm going to list them, and hopefully you can take some notes and recognize some of your own patterns. Number 1, criticize, attack, and scrutinize. 2 is demand and impose. Number 3, hinting, passivity, and suggesting. 4, always and never. 5, judgments, labels, and scrutiny. Number 6 is personalize. 7 is jumping to conclusions. 8, assigning motives. Number 9, complaining and criticizing. And here we are at 10, sarcasm and humor. Those are the top 10 things that I would encourage you to be very, very conscious of anytime that you're engaged in those or you're the recipient of those, to take a minute to step back and to get conscious of the patterns and the ways that you're actually really working against yourself. I was able to gather a question from a client and wanting to know some more information about these top 10 things of what not to do. And she was able to share with me, many of these patterns are habitual. I don't even know that I'm doing that, is what she writes. Do you have any tips for recognizing these patterns? And the good news is, yes, I certainly do, because I wasn't able to necessarily recognize some of my own patterns until after the fact. And that's where I want you to be able to start. Sometimes you don't necessarily recognize these top 10 patterns until things have gone off the rails. But retrospect is still a powerful teacher. It still allows you to be able to tune in. If you can catch it a little bit more proactively, well, that's just even more of a bonus. What I would say is that as you're practicing more of this tool of self-awareness, when you're starting to feel yourself frustrated or disappointed by something, again, remember I said, are you banging your head up against the wall in communication with someone? Chances are you're pretty entangled in some of these top 10 patterns. If you're starting to notice that you're having the same conversation over and over again, maybe you're dreading a conversation or you're repeating yourself often, if you have an ongoing conflict, it's all of those categories where I would encourage you, take a good hard look. Could any of these top 10 patterns be involved? What I would encourage you, remember we talked about the deliberate nature of which most people will plan their vacation. If something is happening, if you are in conflict or there has been something that has happened, can you be as deliberate and intentional with your words to check for these patterns, that you're very clear and concise about what it is that you want to say to people and your willingness to check it out with them? What did you just hear me say? And making sure that if you're hearing someone, be able to connect with them. What I heard you say is such and such. Is that what you were meaning? Be willing to listen. How can you recognize these patterns? Be willing to drop so much into what you have to say and be willing to actually listen to what people are saying. Ask questions, clarify, and get to the point in the most direct way that you can. So in Misunderstood, I write about the SOS toolbox, the sense of self toolbox. There's two tools that I think that I would offer you in this. The first one we've already talked about, self-awareness, and your conscious ability to actually tune in to what you're doing and why you're doing it. The second one that I would offer is self-responsibility. That oftentimes, if things are going awry, we have a tendency to sometimes blame and look outside of ourselves. Well, you didn't hear me correctly, or you always react like that. Self-responsibility puts you in the driver's seat of whatever it is that's happening. Years ago, I was introduced to the work of Marshall Rosenberg. And if you're not familiar with his work, I would highly encourage you to be researching a little bit about his work of nonviolent communication, NVC. I was introduced to this tool many, many years ago, probably about 15 at this point. And it's through his work, Marshall's work of nonviolent communication, that I did a lot of study and a lot of research, and have introduced this tool of nonviolent communication into the work that I do. That's a lot of where these top 10 patterns, these are the patterns that divide our world and set us at war with each other. Marshall was dedicating to help understand what it is in our world that actually connects people. So one of the things with all of my clinical experience and the work and training that I've gotten with Marshall Rosenberg's work is that I developed a workshop called The Art of Effective Communication, in which we talk about these top 10 patterns of what not to do. And then I offer you a 3-step tool where you can begin to tune in to the thoughts, the feelings, the needs, and then develop so much more effective strategies to actually meeting those needs. How often, I compare it to going to the fridge without knowing that you're hungry for. How aware are you of what it is that you actually need? The need to matter, the need to be heard, to belong, the need for information. These are all the reasons why we're communicating with other people. And yet, rarely do people actually know what it is they're hungry for, so to speak. It's through this work, Marshall's work, The Art of Effective Communication, that I have available on my website, that allows you to be educated and so much more fully equipped with an actual tool that can empower you to know what it is that's driving your behavior and your words with other people. I want to help you be more educated about ways to be able to live so much more authentically. So if you're inspired or intrigued by anything that you've heard, the top 10 patterns of what not to do, needs that drive all human behavior, check out my website, AllysonBlythe.com, and you can absolutely buy there The Art of Effective Communication as your way to be so much more empowered so that we can be more conscious and deliberate about the communication that we have. So what is it that you're noticing? If you can recognize any of these top 10 patterns, shoot me a message and let me know how these things have gone. As you clean up your communication and you're conscious about ways that you're starting to use your words more deliberately, and you're aware of these patterns and you're eliminating them to have much more heartfelt communication and conversation with people, what wins are you experiencing? Do you have a story, your own personal walker story, where you're starting to notice some of these things? And if you have a tendency where you start to know that, like, oh, I was able to do this instead of any of those top 10, I would absolutely love to hear. If you have any other questions or ways that I can be of assistance to you, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Ally Effect, Authentically Living Life Your Way, where we hold deep conversation. It's so much more than just basic talk. This is really a heartfelt opportunity for us to dive deep into this idea of authenticity and how to help you build this path along your way. You can join me the first and third Thursday of every single month right here on Transformation Talk Radio, 4:00 Eastern Standard Time and 1:00 Central Time. Next time on the Ally Effect, we're going to be diving deep into yet another topic. Stay tuned. I can't wait to hear more from you. Have a good day.
Thanks for tuning in to The Ally Effect with Allyson Blythe. The moment you decide to take control of your own well-being, you start the journey of authenticity. Tune in next time for more empowering conversations and practical tools to help you shed your fear, worry, comparison, and less than beliefs. Stick with us as you step into the driver's seat and head off onto the road of success and happiness. Your best life awaits.